Hello, about the South Pit of Waterford Heath, otherwise known as Waterford Heath, South Heath. This is a nature reserve maintained by Hertfordshire and Middlesex Wildlife Trust. I should say that I am the warden for the South Heath and also represent butterfly conservation on the Waterford Heath advisory group, but anything that I say in this video is my thoughts and opinion alone. Thank you. What we now know as Waterford Heath was a sand and gravel quarry opened sometime between the two wars, and it closed in the early 1990s, and there was then a slow process of partial restoration up until the late 1990s, when it was reopened as a nature reserve with, at the time, limited access. This access has gradually been extended over recent years until there is basically access either along paths or across the area to pretty well every part of the reserve, with one or two exceptions. The photographs that you'll now see, taken from my own collection, chart the development, not necessarily in a particularly systematic way, the development of the pit from the mid-1990s up until the present day. The amount of restoration that has been done, as I mentioned earlier, was partial, in that some of the upper slopes were planted with trees, mainly for stabilisation purposes, and a small amount of topsoil was imported onto the site. Attempts were made to create a damp area or small pool in the middle of the heath. This is the area that is currently fenced off. However, this has not really succeeded, and the area is now completely dry. As far as I know, no grass or plants were seeded or planted in the area, and so all the vegetation that you see has arrived naturally, or in the case of goat's rue, probably came in with a small amount of topsoil that was introduced onto the site. Goat's rue can be a very pernicious weed which is eaten by virtually nothing and tends to colonise areas, especially if the ground is slightly damp. Drier winters and springs in recent years have prevented it growing to such a great extent as it did in previous years. Very little eats it, as I previously said. We have seen holly blue clouded yellow butterflies lay eggs on it, though there is no evidence that these have ever developed into anything else. And on the whole, as an alien plant, it's something that is not to be desired on a nature reserve. It tends to thrive on areas that have been used for landfill and have then been reclaimed and capped. Digging through my records recently, I came across a brochure and some information leaflets that was produced in the autumn of 1996, and these covered the launch of a project to restore Waterford Pits, as it was then called, as a nature reserve. These were put out by an organisation called Groundwork Hertfordshire, which is part of a national network of environmental charities. They stated that the pits at Waterford were excavated between the 1920s and 1990s, to begin with by a company called Inns & Co, and this company was taken over by Redland Aggregates, who were the owners at the time. And in 1995, funding came from what was then called the Millennium Commission for its Changing Places programme. The aim was to restore for community use 21 derelict or underused sites of no commercial value, and for Hertfordshire £112,000 was received to restore the pits at Waterford, and this was matched by £113,000 from Redlands. Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust had done a survey in May 1996 of Waterford Heath, or what's now called Waterford Heath, and found, and I quote here, the combination of nutrient-poor calcareous soil and a nearby seed source has led to the development of a chalk grassland flora rich in wildflowers across the floor of the pits. This valuable grassland has in turn attracted a variety of animals, including the local uncommon grizzled skipper and brown argus butterflies. The first records of grizzled skipper we have on the site are indeed from May 1996. The brown argus at this point was quite a rare butterfly. It's now rather more widespread across a lot of Hertfordshire. It also mentioned other existing habitats at the site, including willow scrub, which is regenerated naturally over silt beds, temporary pools, pine woodland and a few areas of old woodland. Some of these relate to the North Pit. It also notes that in addition to its ecological interest, Waterford Pits also possesses geological features, including sand cliffs and outcrops of stone. At the launch of the Waterford Pits project, the name of the site was actually changed to Waterford Heath, and funds were raised by the National Lottery and managed by an environmental partnership organisation, Groundwork Hertfordshire, and partners in the project included Hertfordshire County Council, East Herts District Council, Redland Aggregates, Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust, Stapleford Parish Council, Bengio Rural Parish Council and Molewood Residents Association. And many of these organisations, 25 years later, are still represented on the Waterford Heath Advisory Group. The official rename to Waterford Heath was in the autumn of 1996 when there was a public meeting held in Stapleford to which a large number of people were invited to attend and were given a tour of the pits before they were actually available to the public. A map and description of the pits was produced at the same time, and I'll display the map as part of this video. But I think it's well worth reading the description and to think about how different the site is now from what was originally proposed 25 years ago. The floor of the South Pit is covered by grassland growing on a silty soil derived from the old settling beds. The soil is richer than the North Pit and has resulted in a more continuous grass sward and less diverse flora. Pool. A temporary pool is also being created in the South Pit. This pool may not need to be clay lined as the hollow is tending to hold water in its present state. As with the pool on the North Pit, this pool will tend to dry out in the summer, creating a muddy margin attractive to wading birds. As will be apparent to anyone who's visited the site in recent years, the hope that this pool would hold water and still exist has sadly not been fulfilled. Eastern Bank. The high-level bank on the east side of the South Pit includes an existing track used previously by quarrying machinery, which will be incorporated into the network of footpaths. From this track, panoramic views can be obtained across the Beam Valley and Waterford. Additional tree and shrub planting on the bank will enhance the landscape and create sheltered areas of grassland attractive to butterflies and other insects. You'll note that we now try to remove some of those areas of shrub planting on the bank because they're actually restricting the habitat of the larval food plants of the grizzled skipper. Sand cliffs. There are 3 sand cliffs in the South Pit. Those to the north are geologically the most interesting, including outcrops of the gravel motherstone. Some areas of the cliffs may be cleared of the dense trees and shrub cover to create open sandy banks attractive to beetles, solitary bees and other warmth-loving insects. Sand martins may also be encouraged to nest. This has not really happened. The old workshops. The old workshops do not form part of the present project and will remain in place for the time being. At a later date, some form of educational centre for local school groups will be needed on this site. Well, I think it's quite clear that this has never happened, and indeed the buildings, the old workshops that referred to, what most people knew as the Black Barns, were removed a few years ago, having been enclosed in scaffolding to prevent them falling down and fenced off for safety reasons, and leaving quite an eyesore at the top end of the South Pit. The concrete base was left and covered by a thin layer of soil taken from one of the sandbanks further down the quarry, and this has now turned into quite a nicely green area with a lot of St John's wort and 1 or 2 other plants growing on it. And the final area it described was a willow scrub on settling beds. The settling beds remove sand and clay particles from water used to wash the gravel, And old maps of the site show this area as mud and open water. Over the years, the beds have dried out and have been colonised by a succession of plant communities. Today, dense willow scrub dominates the beds, but with time this will thin itself naturally. In the more open areas of the settling beds, interesting plants grow, including orchids such as common spotted, common tway blade and bee. You may be able to see giant horsetails. These are very primitive plants. Their ancestors were the food of the dinosaurs. Well, the settling beds are still very much there and still very much occupied by dense willow scrub in many places, though the Wildlife Trust did remove a section of willow scrub a good few years ago now, and this did at least temporarily become a habitat for grizzled skippers as it was nice and sheltered and warm. The presence of orchids, these seem to have disappeared over the years, though they are found on other parts of the heath, and orchids are notoriously difficult to keep in one place. They tend to die out very quickly and then suddenly reappear for no obvious reason in another nearby habitat. The one thing that is still there are the giant horsetails, though they're not really that giant, but they're certainly horsetails, and these grow towards the northern end of the settling beds in profusion during the summer. Luckily, they don't seem to spread too far because they are one of those plants that can dominate an area to the exclusion of all others. I'm going to shut up now for a bit and let you watch a sequence of some of the more recent pictures of the heath evolving through the seasons. This drone footage was commissioned by me from Jason Smith as part of my research for the book that I published a little bit later in 2016 called The Butterflies of Hertfordshire and Middlesex. It serves to show some interesting angles on the reserve, though it was a shame that it was such a dull day when we were up there taking the footage. It seems that some drivers are so anxious to get to the heath that they can't wait until they get to the official footpath. Unfortunately, there are sometimes incidents along Sacombe Road, like this one, recorded in 2017. Vandalism is not a huge problem on the site, but occasionally we do suffer damage, which is a great shame because it's all costs money and resource from the Wildlife Trust, and is greatly upsetting to the volunteers who have built many of the structures on the site. So this is a view over Waterford Heath South Pit, looking to the north from the picnic spot right down at the southern tip of the heath, just off Sacombe Road, the edge of Bengio. You can see the big bowl at the bottom, and surrounded by banks and trees. As we just pan round this way, you can see by the slope how much land was taken away for sand and gravel extraction before the quarry was abandoned and turned eventually into the current Herts and Middlesex Trust Nature Reserve. A picnic point has been provided here by the Trust to allow people to have a good view over the heath, take a snack and so on, and this is one that's designed to be able to be accessible, so there's a slope up to it, and you can see that there are gaps in the seats which can accommodate a wheelchair or a pushchair to allow as many people as possible with different forms of mobility to actually get up here and see what's going on. Unfortunately, of course, especially since lockdown, some people abuse this, and you can see the remains of barbecues that have been taken place on here. And if we come across here, you can see that something that never used to happen until lockdown is people lighting fires up here. And when the very dry conditions that we get here, this can obviously be quite dangerous. So far we haven't had any problems with bonfires causing grass fires or anything like that, but there's always the potential for that, and as well as the fact that it just looks unsightly. And then as we come down from the picnic point down the unofficial path rather than the more gently graded accessible path, go towards the entrance to the actual reserve, you can see that luckily for us the council provide two bins, a dog waste bin
and an ordinary bin. These frequently get full and overflowing. The council empty them once a week, but the wind of course blows stuff out that's just rammed in the top, as we can see here. I come round every week or so and try and tidy up, get things up off the ground and so on. And in fact this is actually not too bad at the moment. This is the one public right of way across the reserve. It's been here a long time. It's a public restricted byway that leads across to Vicarage Lane and across to the North Heath. And if we just swing round here, we can see that there is the entrance to Molewood, which is the third part of the reserve. And indeed, if we come round here, we can see a map provided by the Wildlife Trust, which shows the three parts of the reserve, and also Waterford Marsh, which is owned by the County Council and looked after by Stapleford Parish Council, on the other side of the railway line, beyond the actual quarry area. So if we come round here, we can see a little pull-in that can hold maybe 5-6 cars, depending on how well people park, and it's amazing the different angles that people park at. And then we have a signboard indicating that we are indeed at Waterford Heath Nature Reserve. This hedge needs to be cut back from time to time, otherwise this gets completely covered. And I noticed that during lockdown a lot of people think that this is actually a district council run park. And indeed the main use, despite it in fact being a nature reserve, because we're on the edge of an urban area, is for people walking their dogs. Right, I'm now going to drop down into the bowl along the ridge that runs along the east side of the reserve, more or less parallel to Saken Road. We're going to have a look on this sunny but rather cold and breezy day, see if we can see any sign of the keynote species of this reserve, the grizzled skipper. Hopefully if they're around, and they are just beginning to emerge, they'll be roosting in plain sight on top of St John's Wort dead heads from last year. So this is the south pit, looking south now from the other end of the bowl. Fortunately, because it's a sunny day, it's a little bit into the sun. But we're now going across the bowl. You can see the willow trees in the settling beds on the south side as we come past. As we spin round, there's a ridge of land which has never been dug out. This path that we're going is the main path, that we're crossing is the main path that goes up to the North Heath. As we come round here, we'll pan down and round and up the middle path that runs along the middle of the East Ridge.
This is looking down across the settling beds and the large amount of woodland that has grown up there and further afield across towards Bramfield. This is one of the sandbanks that is still partially exposed as you go up across the South Heath. And here we have a broader view of the South Heath again, looking north on a nice sunny day. This is the central bowl where once there was water, but now there is just some scrub and some short grass, still fenced off, so it helps to keep dogs and so on out. Then a view around the side of the bowl. And looking back from the side of the heath across to some of the more geological formations that have been noted earlier. This is the original line of the footpath that ran across the heath before it was diverted. This is the very northern tip of the South Heath, showing a van parked right up in the car park by the North Heath and a pile of crushed stone that we sometimes use for path repairs. Here we have a view up to the ridge on which the Black Barns once sat, and this is the top surface covered over with a small amount of topsoil when the Black Barns were removed, and vegetation now growing on the site. And the northern tip again showing that spoil heap of crushed stone and the gates out onto Vicarage Lane. This is the one structure that remains, unfortunately rather used for drinking and drug taking, and increasingly recently for graffiti. We hope it's going to be removed soon. It gives you a fine view out across the heath if it's happened to get caught in the rain. This is one of the geological features that has a little interpretation sign. This is some of the original naturally occurring cement, extremely hard, which is why it was never removed during the quarrying operations. And in fact, we're going to walk up to it and have a closer look at this natural geological formation. Fenced off for obvious reasons, because it's very steep and very rough in here. And this is the interpretation board, somewhat covered in moss and algae. It's been here long, and this dates back to the days when Lafarge were putting up some signs about the site. Just some close-ups showing this sort of rock formation. From a slightly different angle. And here's the sign, hopefully somewhat more readable at this angle. We're now looking back southwards across the heath. And this is the main byway across the heath. And we're now panning across, showing the bowl again. You can see how short the vegetation still is on much of the bowl area. Slightly more growth, particularly wild rose on the slopes as we come up towards the footpath. Pan across to some of the trees that were planted early on in the restoration. This is the end of the unquarried ridge towards the north end of the heath, and again serves to show how little foliage grows on the site. This is actually a pit that was extracted to see what would happen if the little bit of topsoil was taken off, and the answer is not a great deal. We're now dropping down towards the settling beds, so you can see the willow scrub that's been mentioned earlier and the path running through. We're now going to run down that path past one of the benches that's been put in. Just panning back to show some of the birch that also came up on the other side. We did have a few problems with fires in this area last year. And this is up towards the ridge where the horsetail grows, and particularly in the bowl that you can see below. Just coming through when these pictures were taken in the early spring on a rather windy day. Okay, we're now dropping back down into the settling beds. And this is the path that runs down there. Rather fertile soil down here. You can see the amount of nettles that have come up. There's a lot more clay down here, which retains water and moisture, and means it's a lot greener looking than it is higher up on the heath. These are some of the steps built and repaired by volunteers over the years that help you to get down to the bottom of the pit. So we're now back down to the bottom of the settling beds. You can see the path that runs through the willow scrub. And these are some of the cycle tracks that have been dug without any authorisation whatsoever between the railway cutting and the heath. It's amazing what people can do, even if rather ill-advisedly and rather dangerously. Notices have been put up reminding people that this is not a good thing to be doing, and in fact it's been reported to the police, but it doesn't seem to stop anything happening. You can see there's quite a bit of engineering, all dug out with hand tools, but it's not really appropriate for what is, after all, a nature reserve. And people can be putting themselves into quite a lot of danger by taking their bikes down here and running over this very steep and somewhat soft sandy slope. Okay, we're now walking along the path through the settling beds. This was dry at the time of filming, but in the winter and after rain can get very muddy and sticky because of the amount of clay soil that's down here. This is the area that was cleared of scrub a few years ago, and quite a lot of wild strawberry did come up, which enabled the grizzled skipper to gain a foothold down here as well, because this is sheltered area, rather like below the east bank. Unfortunately, we did have a few problems with bonfires being set over the last few years, so this does seem to have ameliorated. We managed to remove the sites, remove a lot of the wood that was left because it was very difficult to remove from the clearing, which has helped no end. Most of the wood that's left there now is quite rotten. Obviously a good habitat for various insects, not so good for bonfires, thank goodness. A few more shots of the same area. So we've now moved up above the settling beds. This is a fairly level area. Unfortunately, it has got a bit of goat's rue growing in it, which we're trying to control. And then just looking back down into that same settling bed area from the top, so something of an aerial view. You can tell we're higher up as the microphone's catching rather more wind noise. You can see, unfortunately, the goat's rue coming up in the short grassland. You can see some of the clearing that was done last autumn to try and help control it. And this is the path that runs along the middle above the settling beds, but below the main part of the heath. We're just looking down into all that willow scrub that grows on the settling beds from above. Very dense, and it's quite a steep cliff reaching down towards it. Certainly needs to be kept well fenced. There we have a full 360-degree scan across this area. Here's a bit more of the path running along the middle there. This area was opened up before the settling beds themselves were opened up. We're just looking again down to all that willow in the settling beds, a lot of wild rose coming up nearer the path. And then we're back up onto the main byway that runs across the site. You can see evidence of the mud that gets there in the winter that was all dried up by the time this was photographed. And we're now going along the byway, looking across the site towards the east bank. I'm just looking back north at this point along that same byway. And thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.